Will and I affirm resolve the United States federal government should adopt a carbon tax. We observe that solving the current environmental crisis should be prioritized over economic harm. Political science professor Cass Sunstein writes in 2007 that because climate change will cause irreversible harm to current and future generations, policymakers should adopt aggressive policies to mitigate climate change. Contention 1, carbon tax would reduce emissions. Subpoint A, domestic emission reduction. By making it more expensive to emit carbon, Brookings Institute fellow Adele Morris finds in 2014 that a carbon tax would incentivize less consumption of CO2-intensive goods. This leads to Synapse Energy Economics study in 2014 to find that a probable U.S. carbon tax would reduce U.S. CO2 emissions by 52% by 2035. There are two impacts. 1, respiratory benefits. Reducing CO2 emissions decreases the amount of pollutants in the air, leading Synapse to find that if the U.S. implements a carbon tax, 227,000 American lives will be saved over the next 20 years. 2, economic health. MIT PhD Tammy Thompson in 2014 explains that high CO2 concentrations lower worker productivity, hurting the economy. She finds that reduced CO2 from a carbon tax would pay back the cost more than tenfold. Subpoint B, global emissions reduction. A U.S. carbon tax would also cause global emissions reduction in 3 ways. 1, the U.S. proportion. According to the EPA in 2014, the U.S. makes up 16% of global emissions. Thus, by decreasing U.S. emissions by 52%, carbon tax would reduce global emissions by over 8.3%. 2, taxing imports. According to a report from the Preservation Institute in 2007, a U.S. carbon tax would also incentivize other countries to reduce their emissions by taxing carbon-intensive goods imported into the U.S. This leads Professor Xiling Zhu to conclude in 2011 that the U.S. carbon tax makes it far more likely that major U.S. trading partners like China and India will limit their emissions. 3, by setting an example. New York University Law School survey in 2015 explains that over 82% of climate experts agree that a carbon tax would induce international cooperation. This is because, according to former U.S. Treasury Secretary Lawrence Summers in 2007, developing countries look to U.S. inaction as an excuse for not cutting their own emissions, excuse best solved with a carbon tax. The impact is mitigating global warming. According to the UN last November, capping global temperatures increases at 2 degrees Celsius would prevent most impacts of climate change. According to Glenn Peters at the University of Ulster in 2012 study, this would require a global emissions reduction of 3%, which could be achieved in each of the 3 ways with a U.S. carbon tax. Convention 2, the U.S. carbon tax promotes clean energy. This occurs in 2 ways. 1, public sector investment. According to Richard Caperton from the Center for American Progress in 2012, $1 billion from any carbon tax revenue would likely go to funding clean tech research and developing climate change solutions. This investment was seen in Alberta, where their carbon tax is being used to fund a new energy efficiency program, and in California, where $600 million from their carbon pricing revenue went to investment in clean technology. 2, private sector innovation. According to economics professor Surgood Nass in 2010, a carbon tax would make fossil fuels more expensive, causing industries to invest in and pivot towards cleaner solutions such as green technology. This impact was quantified as Nass concludes that for every 1% increase in carbon tax, there's an up to 2.4% increase in renewable energy innovation. This has led economics professor Steffi Freud in 2015 to find that a carbon tax would shift the long-run ratio of green tech to fossil fuels by 112.9%, meaning that a carbon tax more than doubles green technology production in relation to fossil fuels. The impact is twofold. 1, increased investment in the U.S. clean energy companies would boost the U.S. economy. According to Synapse, a U.S. carbon tax would boost average income, raise net employment, and increase GDP by $86 billion a year, with total GDP gains of $1.3 trillion. 2, a shift to green technology would also solve climate change in 2 ways. 1, according to Stanford PhD David Fork in 2014, regardless of carbon emissions, advances in clean technology could still solve climate change by allowing the world to produce cheap zero-carbon energy and removing carbon from the atmosphere. Eduardo Porio of the New York Times substantiates in 2014 that green energy would cut emissions by 80% by 2040. 2, spillover benefits. Furthermore, Cambridge professor Terry Barker in 2007 explains that due to new green technology being shared with other nations, carbon taxes lead to a reduction in emissions even in non-tax countries, solving climate change. For those reasons, I urge an affirmative ballot. Thank you. Can I leave these here? Because I assume we'll need them.
Sure. Do you guys want them to?
Good.
No lip, so the whole stop on your slide.
Oh, yeah.
I guess they're going to use them.
I'm probably going to.
Yeah, we can just keep them up there, right?
Yes.
Of course.
Erase the possibility of it sliding off.
So, judges, the order is going to be framework, then our constructive, and then I'm going to move over to their case if I have time. So with that in mind, we'll begin. We gave resolved, the United States federal government should adopt a carbon tax. Observation 1 is the economic harms and impoverishment should be weighed above any other impact for two reasons. First, because economic harms outweigh. The World Bank found that poverty kills 10 million people every year. That's over 1,000 deaths in this debate alone. The World Health Organization explains that poverty kills 40 times more people than the highest potential death toll of climate change. Secondly, it provides the lowest quality of life possible. What's the value of a life that doesn't have quality? As the World Bank explains, poverty means the deprivations of life's most basic necessities and opportunities. So chapter 1 is the ineffectiveness of carbon taxes to affect their solvency. Chapter subpoint A, unilateral action doesn't work. Worldwide carbon dioxide emissions are driven by developing countries, not the United States. Center for Policy Analysis explains that developing nations, which account for 85% of future global emissions, will never enact a carbon tax because they don't want to hurt their already low living standards and income levels. To make matters worse, the Wall Street Journal explains that China and India, the world's largest emitters, have publicly stated they will not impose any climate regulations on their citizens for fear of economic backlash. In fact, the Institute for Energy Research found that if the United States stopped all their emissions today, developing countries would replace those reductions in only 8 years. In addition to this, subpoint B, carbon taxes simply shift emissions overseas. Derek Morgan writes, the American carbon tax would sharply increase foreign emissions. This so-called carbon outsourcing takes place when doing business in America becomes too expensive and the energy industry relocates to other nations such as China. Once emissions migrate to developing nations, they become less regulated. At that point, current environmental regulations like the EPA's required use of catalytic converters can no longer be enforced. Not only do emissions increase, but the most dangerous emissions completely banned in the United States, all of it entering the atmosphere. This is corroborated by an MIT study that found that unregulated nations increase their emissions by 8% when carbon taxes are in place. So, then let's move over to economic harms, which would be the main offense on our side. Chapter 2 is economic harms. Subpoint A, growth. Increased prices on carbon products that destroy the fossil fuel industry, a ubiquitous force in the economy. According to the Daily Caller, economic growth will be reduced by net $1.4 trillion with the carbon tax that cuts emissions. Dr. David Kreuznetz continues that national carbon tax will, quote, trigger employment losses exceeding 1 million jobs on net. Remember to prefer this evidence because it's calculating the net results, not just the changes in government revenue from imposing a tax. Moreover, a report from the National Association of Manufacturers found that a carbon tax would lead to a wages decrease of 8.5% across the board. Subpoint B is consumer price increase. Once actually imposed in Australia, the Washington Examiner found that the carbon tax immediately caused utility and energy bills to skyrocket by 20%. Soon after the country repealed its carbon tax, this goes to show that the long-term effects aren't even going to be fully materialized. In addition to this is important because the Hill explains in 2014 that a U.S. energy price increase of just 10% would push 840,000 Americans into poverty. Remember, in Australia, it increased prices by over 20% within the first year. Subpoint C is inequality. Stanford University writes, under a hypothetical carbon tax, the poorest quintile's burden would be 5.1 times higher than the wealthiest quintiles, because heating and transportation take up a larger portion of poor people's pocketbooks. Inequality is impactful because, as CNN explains, a wide range of social problems are worsened in societies with wealth differences between the rich and the poor. These include violent crime, mental illness, drug abuse, social immobility, imprisonment rates, and so forth. The pro may claim that this problem can be resolved with a revenue-neutral policy. Robert Murphy explains that the idea of a revenue-neutral carbon tax for the United States is very unlikely and not politically feasible. In addition to this, the Washington governor and the governor here in California, Jerry Brown, want to institute a non-revenue-neutral tax that puts money towards transportation projects rather than back into the general public, thus proving that it's not going to be revenue-neutral. So now, moving on to their arguments. First, on their decreased emissions argument, remember, they cite Adele Morris. She's going to reduce emissions. First, you can turn this. Do the pros speculate that the carbon tax will reduce emissions? This is not actually the case in the real world. Platstein writes that in 1999, Norway imposed a stiff tax on greenhouse gases, and since then they've seen the country's emissions increase by 15%. Since 2/3 of Norwegians live in the countryside, they decided to pay up and continue paying for gas. They just decided to continue going to the pump. In addition to this, the IER explains that Australia's carbon tax would allow for greenhouse gas emissions to rise until the year 2017 and not fall below current levels until the year 2043. In other words, the long-term solvency of this is simply too long to look towards in today's round. We need to be looking towards the first and foremost problems, and that's going to be closing up on some framework arguments. Remember, judges, when we talk about today's round, analyze the most important thing is the most pressing issue. It's the oxygen mask analogy. In other words, the first thing you solve is the most pressing issue. You don't look towards the long term until you solve the problems that address this in the short term. For those reasons, value economics and vote negative in today's debate.
Is this in cards?
Yeah, sure. Can you give them to you in prep time? And we do crossfire first and then I give it to you.
Is it good to read you during class?
Just take the
It's going to take a while to pull them up. Can we just do cross?
Sure.
Just start normal? Okay. We'll give you the cards later.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Go ahead and get it. Okay. Since I spoke first, kind of.
Yeah, don't worry.
Okay, great. So when you're talking about harms to the poor and inequality, the internal link to this contention is like increased prices of energy, right?
is twofold. Yeah, increased prices for energy, increased prices for transportation, all those
Okay,
types
but
of
does
things. Yeah.
the increased price for transportation come from like increased prices for like the fuel and stuff like that? Like
Inequality is fueled twofold. One, because of the increased prices in energy. Two, because the first people who start getting laid off when job growth goes down are the poor.
Cool.
So it's actually twofold. Just addressing energy prices isn't going to suffice. Sorry.
Okay, thanks. Would you like a question?
Yeah, sure. So when you talk about how there's going to be an 8.3 reduction in emissions if the United States imposes a carbon tax, right? That was kind of debate mathed out of the idea that there's 15% of America's contribution to the globe is like 15% of emissions in the globe are from America. And then you said if we cut all of the emissions in CO2, it comes down to 8%.
No,
Right.
no. So, debate math has this like weird stigma in debate. Basically, what we're saying is that the U.S. emissions would go down 52% according to Synapse Energy, and since the EPA says that there's 60% of the globe is U.S. emissions, that means that globally it will go down 8.3%
Okay.
in total.
So why hasn't like a professor written about this, or like a study concluded this? Evan, why did high school debaters come up with this idea first, like this 8% number? Why is it that like we have made the breakthrough?
No,
and not academia?
we haven't like made the breakthrough. We're just like doing some simple analysis.
No, here's your problem. You
It's
talk
very
about
simple. Like,
here's where you messed up on the math. Because you talk about CO2 emissions decreasing by 52%, and then you try and corroborate that with total American emissions. You understand that CO2 is not the only thing we put into the atmosphere, right?
I understand that, but I can show you like the fact that like we're 16% of like the CO2
Like you can show
emissions.
me, like the 8% in a card, or you can show me like your calculator.
No, we can show you that they're both aligned with like the CO2 emissions, and furthermore, like
Oh,
salsa
that's
by
not
9%. May I ask a question?
Go for it.
Okay, cool. So at the end of like your last subpoint about like how we're gonna not adopt a revenue neutral carbon tax.
Yes.
Like, so we're talking about at the national level, right?
Sure, we're talking about the national level.
So can
in
you-
fact, we're
yeah.
talking about the plan you cited in case. What was the second card you cited?
The second card that we cite is Adele Morris.
Oh, the Adele Morris, the same Adele Morris that wrote a non-revenue neutral piece of legislation that she then proposed in Brookings Institute, which
Cool,
which
but-
puts $600
yes.
billion towards the deficit. In other words, not money going back into the hands of the taxpayers that are paying it.
Right, so Adele Morris shows you that even without a revenue neutral carbon tax, it's still beneficial, but what we're also going to show
But
you
it's not
is
revenue
even,
neutral.
even both, no, Adele Morris is not revenue neutral, meaning that that's net beneficial, but also when you look at revenue neutral carbon taxes, which are the 6 carbon taxes that are currently on the Senate floor, you're going to see that those are also beneficial in many ways. Do you have a question?
Yeah, sure. So when we talk about promoting clean technology,
Yeah.
have we tried to do this before?
We've never passed a carbon tax before.
Okay. Have we tried to pass billions and billions of dollars on to green tech companies in the hopes that they'll innovate?
And you can bring up evidence, but I can show you that in like Ireland and the EU, these subsidies to the green energy companies much innovation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Can I see that evidence now? Alright, first, the evidence you read about 50% increase in normal. That evidence, then the evidence that revenue neutral is unlikely.
You want me to show you your evidence with Adele Morris?
If you want to show me evidence, go for it.
I'll show you mine.
And then we'll wait.
What piece of evidence are we finding?
We're finding the Norway evidence. Yeah, you see that.
Yeah, the important part that like read it. Yeah, that's it. And
We'll figure it out. Alright,
Remember, we will be doing climate change overall else. There are two reasons. The first is magnitude. Remember, climate change is a far bigger magnitude than any economical harm. Climate change, we're talking about the entire globe here. In fact, according to Elliott in 2016, the World Economic Forum deemed climate change as the greatest threat to economies of the world in 2016 and in the future. We're not even accounting for the massive lives harmed. We need to do away in climate change. The second is irreversibility. According to Hansen in 2009, if we reach 450 parts per million of carbon in the atmosphere, we can no longer stop for climate change. This is important because according to the NWA today, we've already reached 400 parts per million. We'll reach that by we'll reach the point of no return in 25 years. We need to be acting now. If we can show you a risk of solving for climate change, the app has won this debate. Finally, according to Ian Perry, Director of Fiscal and Environmental Policy at the IMF, a carbon tax is unequivocally the #1 policy to reduce emissions while still preserving the economy. So because we should do whatever it takes to stop climate change, and because this is the best way to do it, you vote for us off the risk of offense. However, even by that, let's go on to the contentions. And the first contention is about the economy. The first is that unilateral doesn't work. There's a few issues with this. The first issue is that according to Ian Perry, again from the IMF, comprehensive carbon pricing in the EU would also promote international dialogue among single pricing initiatives of other large countries. We're showing how carbon tax leads to multilateral action. We're giving the warm, right? According to Summers in 2007, we said in the first subpoint of our case, countries right now use the U.S. as an excuse for not doing climate change. They say, oh, the U.S. has done it. Why should we? If we do it, we lead by example. Then we talk 8.3%. They say it's debate math versus multiplying numbers. It's not novel. Now, why we're discussing a carbon tax right now, because it would be decreasing this carbon emissions. We're telling you it's the carbon emissions that are causing global warming in the atmosphere. That's how you measure it. We're decreasing carbon emissions. That's how we're doing it. We're also saying, again, China and India are incentivized to decrease their emissions because we're having these import taxes. We are leading an international movement. The only project cited from the Institute of Energy Resources who uses different economic models that they never reveal and is funded by the Koch brothers look to the fact that we are decreasing emissions overall. Then they talk about overseas and how there'll be leakage. But remember, they don't actually give you any empiric for this. They never give you a reason. All they give you is Norway, and then they're saying Norway there was a carbon tax, and then 20 years later emissions went up. Yeah, emissions ever go up normally. Just they don't give you comparative analysis. They're not saying what would happen without a carbon tax. We're saying probably the carbon tax would have gone up by more without that. And furthermore, when you're looking at leakage, it just doesn't happen for a few reasons. One, Fullerton in 2014 writes out all articles addressing leakage, but even taking into account future price and elasticity, we're taking that into account. You slash that by 66%. According to the EPA, 70% of emissions, like transportation emissions, can't even physically be linked. So slash that again by 70%. And then again, there's two reasons why leakage wouldn't happen. Shielding here, we read you in cases that U.S. carbon tax would also be taxed on exports. It wouldn't matter if you go overseas, if you still be taxed on imports, no economic incentive, countries won't move. The second is that Ian Perry from the IMF says the most likely way to get support for a carbon tax, the most likely carbon tax, is when it's bundled with corporate tax reform, which causes companies still want to stay in the U.S., they wouldn't go overseas. This is empirically shown. Terry Barker shows in the most overwhelming empirical example of all the European pricing systems, one that outside of that, you saw decreases in emissions. Leakage doesn't happen. If anything, Barker says it is negative leakage. Now, on their second issue about economy, the first is economic growth. They say that economic growth will decline for few reasons. First off, they're only talking about the harms, not the benefits. Weigh it holistically. This is very important because according to Perry in 2008, what you see is that overall a carbon tax would lead to a benefit of like 4.2 million jobs. So when you account for the loss of jobs in manufacturing sectors, you're looking at a net benefit of 2.7 million jobs. Or Synapse Energy Economics takes into account all sectors, a net benefit of trillions of dollars. We're seeing overall there is a benefit. So just because they're giving you unique harms doesn't mean there's not benefits. When they talk about wage decreases, this is the National Association of Manufacturers. Yes, manufacturers also go down, overall they increase. Then they talk about hurting the poor, and this is also linked to inequality. There's a few reasons why this would happen, but really you just need to look holistically. If you look to health, you extend MIT PhD Thompson from our case, who shows that increased health benefits of the poor outweigh any economic cost of a carbon tax tenfold. If you look to tax rebates, look to MIT Professor Rao, shows that tax rebates, just like the ones that benefited low-income households in places like British Columbia, wouldn't be needed to pass the carbon tax and would outweigh any economic cost. Third, you look to welfare benefits. According to U.S. Treasury Analyst Dana Moore's welfare benefits, which aren't accounted for in any other studies, actually outweigh general economic harms and lead to a net gain of 0.13% each year. Overall, the poor are being helped. helped. This is why it's important. This has been seen empirically in British Columbia. The poor are being helped. They don't live in inequality. But you need to remember, the one thing that hurts the poor the most is climate change. The one thing that hurts the poor the most are these emissions that we reduce. We could save 227,000 people each year. The thing that hurts the poor the most is that climate change could reduce food output by 82%. Poor can't deal with climate change. That's why you rank climate change overall, and that's why we urge a vote for the affirmative.
Let's take prep time.
Before we take prep, I want to see the 20 term 25 years hard.
Yep.
And I'd like to see not net, that our evidence was not net.
Our style of war. Yeah.
No, the one about the one you read, like where you said it wasn't net.
Are you talking about jobs or the poor people?
1 million jobs.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I can pull that from you.
Awesome. But really more important than the point of
Yep.
Also, do you guys
It doesn't matter. Preservation Institute. I'll put it up for you.
if you don't mind.
I can get the preservation institute. Definitely. I appreciate it. No problem. You want to like read these two first, and then I'll do the other show. I have preservation institute too. So these are the import tax.
You want to read the question and then second you don't read the question.
Take a prep.
Alright, pause. Here's
Judges, I'm going to be doing some framework analysis at the beginning, and then going into the back. Firstly, let's start with framework. Clearly, the climate change right now is irreversible. According to the NOAA, the climate change that is taking place because of increases in carbon dioxide concentrations is irreversible for 1,000 years after emission stops. That is right now according to that evidence, which means we are already at the point of irreversible. So we need to look towards what is the biggest magnitude and what is the oxygen mass problem that we need to solve right now. Let's look at magnitude. You can clearly extend the fact that climate change's highest potential death toll is 40 times lower than what poverty kills right now. It's 250,000 people versus 10 million every single year. So you look towards magnitude of lives, it's clearly going to flow towards the poverty side in our case, in which we prove that 850,000 of Americans will be pushed into poverty as a result of the carbon tax in America, and 10 million people worldwide. Then they talk about quality of life. Clearly, when it comes to quality of life, there is no reason to live if your quality of life is poor. That means poverty is going to outweigh lives in general. So let's move on to their case. First, you start with how emissions decrease. Firstly, you can turn this argument because according to Norway, I showed them this evidence, they imposed a stiff tax on harmful gas emissions. Since then, the country's emissions have actually risen 15%, which means Norway's emissions have not gone down after a carbon tax. The same thing happened in Australia. Their carbon tax allows greenhouse emissions to rise until the year 2017 and will not fall below current levels until 2043. Then, let's talk about how it's going to decrease global emissions. First of all, they don't even give a real card for this. They just do debate math. Why is there no scientific breakthrough where there's actually academia saying this would happen on a global level? Why is it that we need their calculator to figure out that it happens? The simple reason is because of carbon outsourcing. We gave you in case, according to the International Panel on Climate Change, carbon outsourcing will be 130% leakage rate because there is cheap labor in these other places, and because these countries can move over there because it is much cheaper. That's 130% leakage rate because there's cheaper labor and there's no regulations in places over there. Then, let's look towards their evidence about how we're talking about respiratory benefits and economic health. They cite Remy, but according to Edwin Mills' an 11-page paper attacking Remy, the conclusion of Remy, the paper, is that Remy frequently exaggerates the benefits of proposed government projects. Such biased analysis cries out for explanation. They talk about how it will create jobs, but they give no warrants as to why this is true. We actually prove in our analysis that we'll lose $1.4 trillion and it will decrease 1 million jobs because that is on net to all the fossil fuel sectors that affect our entire economy. Then let's talk about economic health. According to the investigation that looked toward a relationship between CO2 concentration and work performance were collected, and the effective ventilation rate on work performance was between 0 and 1%. So clearly the economic health thing isn't there, so you can just cross that impact off the flow. Then let's talk about how it's going to expand globally. Firstly, China in the status quo already has a cap and trade program that's starting next year, so clearly it's moving without the United States. And secondly, they talk about what U.S. economists think, but if you look towards Chinese officials, Li Gao has said that a carbon tax will be a disaster, prompting a trade war between the United States and China because it creates tariffs between these two nations. So clearly, look towards real world what Chinese officials are saying versus speculations on how it's going to spread. Then we can look towards the fact they talk about new green tech. Firstly, right now the United States federal government, according to Julian Morris, has invested $150 billion into renewable energies and have nothing to show for it. We only have 0.2% of our electricity production comes from solar energy. And according to the Daily Caller, 50 of Obama's green tech programs these companies have actually failed. And you can also turn this argument because according to Thomas Sheffield, 9 jobs lost for every 4 created through renewable energy. So then you can also talk about public sector investment. They talk about revenue neutrality, but judges, a massive concession is that their proposal is not revenue neutral. They talk about Adele Morse, but according to the IER, which pointed out how fallacious she was, is that there's a $695 billion going into the deficit and not back to the people, and he noted that it was a very big mistake for people to claim that that's revenue neutral, and clearly our opponents did the same thing, but didn't understand that it's not revenue neutral. So then, let's move to our side of the flow. Clearly on framework, you're going to be looking at outweighing, so let's talk about the impact. Firstly, they say that it promotes more dialogue about how it's going to be spread, but once again, you can cross-apply arguments. If you look towards what the Chinese and Indian officials are saying right now, they are not adopting a carbon tax. They already have cap and trade, but they will not move to carbon tax because that is a significantly bigger step for their economies. Then, on carbon outsourcing, they say that we don't give a number. I read the IPCC evidence, it's 130% leakage rate. They talk about how it's just carbon emissions, but we're talking about all emissions. Then, they talked about Remy evidence on our contention too about growth, but you can cross-apply the Remy indict that Remy frequently exaggerates the benefits of its government proposals, and they give actually no warrant for why it would lead to an increase in jobs. Then on price increases, this goes cold extended across the flow. Clearly prices are going to increase, that pushes 850,000 innocent Americans into poverty. On inequality, you can cross-apply my arguments. Their own evidence is not revenue neutral, so none of these rebates are going to come back to low-income citizens. Moreover, how can we have rebates, but also public sector investment? They know that there's going to be public sector investment, but also rebates. How's all this money going to formulate into the U.S. federal government's hands? For all these reasons, we should calm out.
Can I see the 130% before transfer? I'm going to get transfer.
Yeah, sure.
You want me to find it?
Yeah, I'm already doing transfer. Anyway, I'm sure you Alright, cool. Yeah. Let's go. Alright. Can I ask a question?
Yeah, sure.
Is this 130% which is off of carbon tax?
Yes, it's talking about the carbon tax.
No, it's
the
not.
leakage rates created from
It's
the carbon
talking about
tax.
the Kyoto
It said there could be a rate between 25%
It's talking about
and
the Kyoto
100%
Protocol,
leakage
not a
rates.
carbon tax.
Do you know what the Kyoto Protocol is?
I know it wasn't a carbon tax.
Okay, do you understand the difference between the Kyoto Protocol and a carbon tax?
Yes.
Okay, what's the difference?
Alright, there's a massive difference. First, Kyoto Protocols initially tried to be a multilateral thing. It failed in the
What
US
does it do for carbon prices in the United States?
What it would do for carbon prices in the United States? It wouldn't have the exact same mechanism. It wouldn't set a price. It wouldn't have the price be set for all industries.
It completely caps emissions for companies,
Right.
so they have an
So
incentive to move to other nations.
But
That's the specific legal
my question is, it's not a carbon tax, right? It's like a carbon tax is a whole other environmental
There's
policy.
no difference in terms of how companies would move as a result of cap and trade and a carbon tax. Do you mind if I ask you a question?
There's absolutely difference.
Mind if I ask you a question? You talk about revenue neutrality, but according to Adele Morris's plan, she's going to put $695 billion
Right,
in the
we
United
just
States.
look at Adele Morris
What do
to
you
say
that's not
that
revenue
taxing
neutral?
emissions reduce emissions.
Okay,
We're not
so
saying
can we not accept that offense if it's not revenue neutral, right? You can't have both. It either
Okay,
can't
stop,
decrease
stop.
emissions or it's not
if
revenue
you're
neutral.
saying a tax emissions would reduce emissions, that's your burden. But we're saying that 6 out of 6 proposals in the U.S. Congress for carbon tax were revenue
What
neutral.
proposals?
We are
What
saying,
part was that that said that?
my friend can bring up. We just like,
Why did you guys cite the only one that wasn't revenue neutral then?
no, we didn't cite a specific tax. We're just talking about Adele Morris. We're just saying in general.
That's
when
her
you-
specific
when you
carbon tax
tax
proposal.
fossil fuels, it'll go down. All right, we can show you the credit again. But like what we're saying is just like when you tax emissions, this should go down. We think that's logical. That's what Remy Fest
All right.
is.
Okay, so let's talk about the Remy evidence, right?
Absolutely,
So
yeah.
are you aware that tons of economists have attacked Remy for actually exaggerating the benefits of government proposals?
I mean, there's two responses. First, like of course, like conservative economists will attack any like progressive proposal.
That's
But secondly, what we're
not
saying is this isn't just Remy. This was Remy and Synapse Energy Economics and then like the
We're
K
citing
Plus study.
representatives,
We're using 3 different. This is a congregation of 3 different economic models that we're saying. They look at all the economic models. They average them. This is okay, fine. We're saying this is the most influential evidence. And also, I want to talk about jobs really quick.
Okay, sure.
So you're saying there's 1.1 million jobs, but in your own rebuttal, you say, quote, jobs on net in the fossil fuel industries. So if we're showing you on like when the renewable energy industry's jobs
We're
increase,
talking about the ripple effects of the jobs. For
But you're
example,
talking
remember the
about
Thomas
fossil fuel
Chepler,
industries,
right?
right?
To answer your question.
All right.
Remember the Thomas Chepler card that I read in the rebuttal, which says that for every 9 jobs are lost for every 4 created through renewable energy. Which means if you actually look towards the ripple effects,
All right.
which our evidence does,
Yeah, and we
because
have been
fossil-
saying
mind if I finish
like
the
3
question?
times more jobs.
Because
Like,
fossil
that's
fuels
just-
are so
okay.
ubiquitous, it's actually going to kill other sectors, and you're going to lose jobs in other
Right, but
places.
that 1.1 million, like specifically, it's just talking about a loss in the manufacturing industry.
No,
correct?
it's talking about
Then why in rebuttal do you say on net
projecting
fossil
losses
fuel jobs?
exceeding 1 million jobs.
In the fossil fuel industry.
No, because the fossil fuel sector is ubiquitous. I'm sorry
Right,
if I'm
because we're
misquoting that.
losing from the fossil fuel industry. All right,
No, in the entire United States economy. In fact, this study actually looked at the excess burden of the tax.
Right, so you looked
which
at
means
right
not
now-
different from
okay.
the direct burden, but the excess
Right, but
burden.
when you see
All right, so let's talk about how it's going to spread to other nations, right?
Absolutely.
Which evidence would we rather prefer? What United States economists think will happen or will prompt dialogue, as you said,
Yeah.
or what the Chinese officials said would cause a trade war and be a disaster for his country?
The Chinese are going to say anything to try to protect. Like Chinese are like, oh look, don't
What do
put
you
in taxes. We'll go to trade war. China says a lot of things. I think like the
Why are you
Republican
gonna trust-
climate change doesn't exist. Like, just because
Are you-
people say things doesn't mean it's a legitimate.
You're right.
threat.
So
They
do you
haven't gone
trust
to
what
war
the Chinese
over
official
current-
says or what United States economists think?
I
will happen?
trust-
Simple trade.
the world economists that were like, surveyed, like the majority of world economists. That's what I would go with. Okay, all right. You can have your evidence back.
Thanks.
Your computer. All right. Let's take turns.
Okay. 50 seconds used, 37 seconds remaining. Well,
Yeah.
my comments? Okay. The biggest
impacting this round is climate change. First of all, because of irreversibility. They try to tell you that NOAA has you that's already irreversible. That's not what they're saying. And by 2040, it will be irreversible, so we have to focus on it now. Second of all, we outweigh our magnitude. They try to tell you that there's like 40 times more deaths from poverty. That's in the status quo. You see that climate change is going to spiral out of control, killing more and more people, killing tens of millions of people, and eventually possibly causing extinction. Now go into our case. The first thing you're going to be extending is domestic emissions. They try to tell you that in Norway they didn't have to, but they don't do the comparative analysis between what happens with the carbon tax and what doesn't happen. We do the comparative analysis of British Columbia and conclude that it was actually successful. That's why Snips Energy tells you that there's a 52% reduction. Of course, they're going to have conservative economists who indict the source, but you should extend this across their flow. Then the EPA tells you that this means there's an 8.3% global reduction. Now, what's the warrant for this? Look to our second contention about clean tech. They put one response on this, which is that like we've already invested money and it hasn't worked. Now, actually, I can show you that it has worked. We've had a 250% increase in green tech. But first, second of all, they drop our second warrant, which says that the government doesn't even have to invest money. Companies are just going to be incentivized. We empirically in Ireland that a carbon tax of 1% increased innovation by 2.4%. And second of all, we read you Barker, who says that when there's a carbon tax in the EU, this not only made more green tech in the EU, but this also made 3% more green tech in other countries. And then second of all, we also tell you that the green tech could solve for 80% of CO2 emissions, which also solves for global emissions. Then go on to our subpoint B about the global emissions. They try to tell you that like China won't trade emissions. Their evidence is from the status quo. In the status quo, they're not going to shift. What we're saying is when we pass the carbon tax, that incentivizes them to shift. We provide you with the NYU evidence that says that 82% of experts agree. That's why. Now go on to why they're not winning. They're going to try to extend this economics contention. This is wrong for a couple of reasons. First of all, realize that we are going to pass a revenue neutral test. 6 out of the 6 revenue proposals on the Congress floor are revenue neutral tax, and 60% of Americans support a revenue neutral tax as opposed to not one. We're going to pass a revenue neutral tax, which means we have to account for increased welfare, we have to account for rebates, and then you see that on balance this is beneficial. But furthermore, climate change still outweighs, because remember, climate change kills 227,000 people every year. When we solve for climate change, we solve for that. And second of all, climate change will decrease food by 82%, which will also harm the poor.
Alright, so the basically evidence that 6 out of 6 proposals are revenue neutral.
Yeah, of course.
And the evidence of green tech increasing around 1%.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm going to pull up examples. I think you should put two.
Yeah, do you want to show them the apps? Yeah. You want 66% of Americans support a revenue neutral tax, or just the
Yeah, and they're sponsoring us here.
Yeah.
That's it.
Let me see the other. So this right here. I don't want to take from it. I don't have to explain it a little bit. This lists the 6 current proposals in yellow is highlighted like the part that says revenue neutral, and then
Are these all current? Is one of the current designers using on?
these are the current proposals that are like still being like lobbied for. So regardless of like when they were proposed, they're still being lobbied for.
Okay.
And then at the bottom, there is
His proposal
yeah.
was a long time.
Yeah, and at the bottom there is a couple of these aren't highlighted in yellow, and so we went and we just like went through the actual text of the thing, and it'll say stuff like we wrote these things right there or something. No, it's just quotes from each of the 6 proposals themselves. I mean, you can read it those. Okay, great. If you have a specific one, I can always show you.
just going to be framing, and then negative case, and then the affirmative case. I'll try and sign here to be clear. With that in mind, we'll jump right into it. They continue to tell you that the climate change outweighs. First, they never respond to the highest potential death toll for climate change evidence which we give you, which they say, which the World Health Organization says, is less than 40 times that poverty kills in the status quo. So right now, poverty is inflicting many more damage, much more damage than climate change ever could. They're not just talking about in the status quo climate change. We're talking about overall the highest potential death toll from these models. In addition to this, you can also look towards the fact that that's irreversible damage as well. People who are losing their lives because they're in poverty, that's an irreversible harm that the economy is weighing into. So don't just buy their arguments on irreversibility like climate change is the only thing that's irreversible in the world. Then, when they try and talk about how we're going to reduce emissions, they never respond to the Norway evidence which says that it increased by 50%. They also never respond to the fact that there's a 130% overall increase by the OECD. They try and argue this is from the Kyoto Protocol, but the Kyoto Protocol said that when there is environmental regulation that increases the price of carbon, then that increases the amount of emissions overseas by 130%. What does that mean? That means that when a carbon tax increases the price of carbon, that the emissions increase overseas. But now let's talk about the more important thing, which is economics in today's round. You can extend cleanly the term that my partner made from Chaplin. 9 jobs lost for every 4 that are created in green technology. So even these subsidies that are going to be going into green technology are harming the economy. That's a big voter on our side. Then, when we talk about the economy, again, on our side of the flow, they try and respond to the idea that growth is not net. What we're not looking at is net. One, it's just an evidence wash. We're giving you net numbers from the Heritage Foundation. They're giving you net numbers from REMI. But remember to prefer ours because Edward Mills indict on how REMI is largely ineffective and largely over-exaggerated for climate change lobbyists. Then, in addition to this, you can clearly extend across the flow the arguments about consumer price increasing and impacting that out is 840,000 people being put into poverty. They try to respond to this by saying it's not going to happen and that we're going to make up for it with tax rebates. But remember, one, the plan they cite in their case isn't revenue neutral. In addition to this, the 6 cases they give you put some money back into the economy, but it's not revenue neutral because not all of the money they take out of the economy is put back into the economy. At that rate, it's going to be a loss for the economy, and that means that it bites into our inequality arguments because the poorest are paying the most. Finally, they try and say that welfare is good, but remember that jobs are preferable to being on welfare, and so when we're cutting jobs and people are losing their jobs, it's going to be worse for the economy. So at the end of the day, you're going to be voting con pretty easily. Ready to press it? Yeah. Don't mind if we ask the question. Yeah, that's not. So I was curious. You guys cite the NOAA as the point of no return for 2042. The reason I was really curious to see the PDF was because we have a piece of evidence from the NOAA from the same time period that says for the next 1,000 years, climate change is locked in.
Yeah, no, we're saying.
Don't you think that,
okay, so can I
considering your history with today, math is possibly attacked on?
Well, I mean, I know like multiplication, we've covered that, but specifically on the NOAA,
When you're saying it's going to continue for 1,000 years, you know what that means? Right now, this, we can't solve this. I'm fine right now. Like, this air conditioning could be better, but right now I'm living. If this continues for 1,000 years, that's not that bad. If we continue to 2042, then we're going to see massive harms to the environment. What you're saying is right now, you're saying these effects of climate change continue. The effects of climate change right now are irreversible, but right now they're livable. In 2042, they won't be livable, and that will continue. That's what we're talking about. That's your question now?
all right, so again, the main job for all matters. So we should be looking down on
pay for every 4 jobs created in the green energy sector, 9 are lost in the economy.
All right, so what's the specific warning?
We give you a number. Sure, I'll explain. Because it has ripple effects. The fossil fuel industry is what fuels a large amount of our industrial complex in the United States.
But if we're specifically subsidizing jobs.
Exactly. So you subsidize green jobs, but you cut out people who are like truckers and those types of people who are going to have to pay for more money in gasoline and that type of energy cost. That affects the economy. When you look at
jobs,
net,
you have to pay more gas prices. Like people around the country,
it becomes less
like
economically
the Midwest versus the coast.
Gas prices will go down. You have to move resources around for an economy. It's pretty simple economics that you can't just narrow it down to the energy.
I understand the logic, but you don't have when you look on net, right?
No,
on net.
You keep saying net because you're acting like the debate is a race to say net because that's unfortunately
what a lot
of
the debates compare green jobs.
But we're giving you warrants as to why the ripple effects in the economy are so drastic because of how ubiquitous fossil fuels are.
Yeah, and we're telling you right now when you invest in green jobs, all the fossil jobs don't have to decrease.
So why have we invested $150 billion in solar
And
energy?
that's a really good point, and I'm really glad that we're talking about this. We're saying right now, you can throw a lot of money at green energy, maybe it works, maybe it doesn't, but the fact is, fossil fuels right now are just too cheap, it's hard to do good investment. When you actively make fossil fuels like 30% more expensive, so like they're not looking so cheap, and green energy is really incentivized to really work. And that's why in places with carbon taxes, you've seen increase in green innovation like in Alberta, like
What's the difference between giving a subsidy towards a green energy firm to reduce the cost of green energy and making coal or oil more expensive. It's just trying to close the
No,
gap
well,
between two
okay, so,
technologies. If one doesn't work,
yeah,
just make that
the carbon tax is specifically different because the carbon tax is like forever on all dirty fuels. A subsidy is like that short term.
We're giving those dollars to those companies forever.
Now we get still that will
We
also
can't get the money back.
So I think there's two important things here. The first is that like we're giving subsidies, but basically what we're saying was we can give subsidies and impose a carbon tax, which makes it even more valuable to invest in green tech. But the second thing is a subsidy is a targeted policy. So you just like say like we're going to give subsidies for wind, which makes a lot of people jump into wind. With like a carbon tax, it incentivizes diversification of different types of alternative energy, and that's why it's more effective.
I'm not seeing a warrant behind that.
Framework, and just talking about emissions, and then very finally the environment. How do you go about this? Alright, let's begin. Let's begin our framework. Now, they keep saying lives are irreversible and we keep focusing on the economy. We're saying the economy through lives are lost now, an improved economy in the long term is fine. We're saying climate change by 2042, disaster effects will be locked in for the rest of time. We can't solve back for this. And also, we're saying, even Elliot, when they're talking about the economy, Elliot says climate change is a bigger threat to the economy even today. So overall, you need to weighing climate change. Therefore, we need to look to Ian Perry, he never says, oh, carbon tax is the best way to reduce global emissions, best way to solve for climate change. This is important. If we have a risk of solving for climate change, you vote for us off of that. Now let's talk about emissions. First, domestic emissions. We tell you domestic emissions will be reduced by 52%. Even before we account for global warming, we tell you specifically reduces the harmful carcinogenic particulate matter in the air, saving 227,000 lives. You can vote for us on that. Please, in fact, it goes to your job. Even if not, we're telling you that this does lead to an 8.3% reduction in global emissions. They're saying, oh, this is the amount of lives than other people have done before. No, it's still multiplication. We'll also give warrants. We give warrants. First of all, we say that import taxes and other things will make it that no carbon leaks. We also say green tech will decrease. Now they talk about leakage. Remember, this is the Kyoto Protocol. To their logic about our debate math, it's so novel. If it's not a novel idea for leakage, why don't they have a single piece of evidence that they bought the bill and saying a carbon tax increased leakage? Why they were living on the Kyoto Protocol? I'll say why. It wasn't a carbon tax. Entirely different policy. It's also non-binding. Like a carbon tax is inherently different. With these import taxes, with this corporate tax reform, we're showing there won't be leakage. We have seen leakage empirically. In fact, because of the spread of green check, Barker finds in Europe during all of their carbon tax in a meta-analysis, emissions outside Europe went down. That's an empiric. We're actually showing with the carbon tax it goes down, regardless of what the Kyoto Protocol is. The carbon tax reduces emissions. Now we're talking about green tech. Remember, we tell you because we're uniquely increasing the price policy of all things for fight for green tech. We incentivize it. This might empirically we're going to be seeing an overall 112% increase. This is important because they drop the impact. A carbon tax investment in green technology reduces our emissions 80%. That alone, again, is enough to solve for climate change. And furthermore, remember, 82% of economists agree this leads to future action. So if we're leading future action, we have a chance of solving for climate change. Empirically, this has led to reductions in emissions. Remember, they're just talking about the Kyoto Protocol, and they talk about Norway. Norway, they're not saying, they're saying 25 years went up. I'm saying because of the carbon tax. And then finally on the economy, remember, we're watching the economy, but finally Perry says even with that 1 million decrease on net, there's a 2.7 million increase in jobs. Therefore, we urge to vote for the affirmative.
You guys have 5 seconds to prep. That's good.
5 seconds, very good.
So judges, I'm just going to be going over the big voting issues and wrapping up the framework.
Your first big voter for the con side is emissions. We made it very clear that even with carbon taxes, specifically carbon taxes in Norway and Australia, we saw a 15% increase in Norway, and on Australia we saw them that kept increasing till 2043. That means that people still need these fossil fuels and will still continue to buy, and emissions will still continue to grow with the population increases. On carbon outsourcing, they don't make a big difference between the Kyoto Protocol and the carbon tax. The simple fact of the matter is they both increase prices and force countries to move, companies to move overseas, which leads to an 130% leakage rate. We gave you an empiric for why the cheaper labor, and the regulations will lead to an increase in carbon outsourcing in other places. And even if that's not true, we read through very specific defense that it will replace in 8 years if only the United States does a carbon tax. Now, that is contingent on the rest of the world not adopting a carbon tax. There's a reason why they didn't go for that final focus, is because everyone knows that the Chinese official saying that the Chinese won't adopt a carbon tax, and the Indian official saying the same thing, is going to outweigh their evidence about U.S. economists that are simply looking through rosy-colored glasses. So we're clearly winning emissions. They don't solve the emissions problem. But the bigger voter is economics. Let's move to economics. Firstly, price increases. Clearly, carbon tax increase the prices by 20%. That's going to be in the United States, and a 10% increase pushes 840,000 innocent Americans into poverty. That's right in our framework. That's going to be a huge terminal offense for our side. Then secondly, 9 jobs lost for every 4 created through renewable energy. They never responded to that evidence. We simply make it very clear that jobs lost across the entire economy. I read that chart on our case, on their case. That is clear offense for us. And then third, the arguments about growth on both sides. Remember, we had competing evidence, but I actually read index for why their evidence actually exaggerates their benefits. They gave nothing back. So clearly we can assume that it's going to lead to job losses. And then on inequality, this is the biggest voter for our side. Clearly on inequality, 5 times more the poor pay, and they say there's going to be rebates, but clearly there is no actual rebates for these people. So going down the framework, that's your third voter. Clearly, climate change is irreversible will give you NOA offense that says that it's irreversible. So let's look towards who kills more people. Climate change, at its highest goal, they said to kill 250,000 people. We have that evidence too. Poverty kills 10 million people right now. That is 40 times more. So clearly when you look towards the more pressing problem, you have to solve the one on our side of the debate flow. We are putting Americans into poverty, which is going to kill more people on this side. So clearly when you look towards lives and economics, we're clearly winning. Accessing our offense, it's going to be a clear combo. Thank you.